Thanks so much for joining us here on 9 News Plus. I'm Chris Bianchi. Now, this past summer, we got a fair bit of rain in Colorado, probably sparing us what could have been a very nasty wildfire season. Now, that rain was mostly thanks to a good amount of moisture from the monsoon, which also, in turn, helped improve Colorado's drought situation. But, and this is key here, folks, unfortunately, a lot of those benefits from the monsoon may not last. Let me explain this. For more on that, and also a bit more of an explanation about how that monsoon moisture may not last as long as, say, winter precipitation, we're now joined by Colorado Assistant State Climatologist Dr. Becky Bollinger. Becky, thanks so much for joining us here on 9 News Plus today.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
Well, first of all, the monsoon, let's start off on a good note. The monsoon really did deliver this summer, didn't it?
Yep, we did have a great monsoon season. It started a little bit early for where we are located. It started, I would say, in mid-June, where in some southern Colorado, we had a great boost of moisture and a very wet June for areas of southern Colorado, where it's typically the dry time before the monsoon season starts. And thankfully, that continued through July and August, where we saw a very consistent and active precipitation pattern for most of the state, including those higher elevations, forested areas where we get concerned about wildfire activity in the summer.
What's fascinating to me, Becky, is that the monsoon is a little bit of a black hole meteorologically. We understand a lot of things about a lot of weather, but the monsoon, it kind of comes and goes, and it's still something we don't totally understand. With that caveat in mind, is there any specific thing we can attribute this busy monsoon season to?
Yeah, it's hard to say. Like you said, there are monsoon seasons around the entire globe, and usually those ones, like ones that happen in the Indian Ocean, are very well studied and very well understood. And the monsoon that we experience, called the North American monsoon, that comes up from the Pacific Ocean, the Gulf of California, and into the Southwest United States, is a much smaller degree in magnitude, and I think that makes it just a little bit harder to understand the mechanics of it. Plus the fact that you're adding in such an active summer weather pattern anyway over a lot of the United States, and that really kind of muddies the waters on what are the mechanisms that cause that. And some people have tried to, make that connection with La Nina, that perhaps there is a stronger monsoon season, particularly for Arizona and New Mexico during a La Nina. And so that could have possibly had some sort of an impact. How far north that comes. So basically, how that translates for the monsoon season in Colorado is a lot more hand wavy and uncertain, and so we really don't know. But I would say that what we saw is very consistent with what we want during a monsoon, not just the precipitation, but the much higher dew points, which we kept through a lot of the summer. And so regardless of how it happened, we're very glad that it did, and thankful that we can still get these after several years of not much activity during the monsoon seasons.
Since you're the assistant state climatologist, well, thank you, Becky. So we'll thank your hand waving for this active monsoon season. That said, maybe a bit more detail about maybe in terms of how much this improved the drought situation. You specifically mentioned Southern Colorado. Could you get into more detail about how much this improved the drought?
Yeah, so we had areas widespread through southern Colorado that were in D1 drought, D2 drought. Those are moderate to severe drought categories according to the U.S. Drought Monitor. We had a fair bit of D3 drought, which is that red color. You get into the extreme drought. And we were able to erase a lot of that with that precipitation that we saw. Some areas have gone down to showing no drought at all, or just that abnormally dry category of D0. So we did see widespread improvements throughout the state. The only place we didn't see improvement and actually saw worsening conditions was in the northeastern corner of the state. And that was specifically where they just didn't get the same amount of activity in the summertime thunderstorms that the rest of the state got.
unfortunate for them, but certainly a boon for everybody else. With that said, that now concludes the good news portion of the program. Transitioning over to the bad news portion of things. Unfortunately, here, Becky, we kind of mentioned at the start that the moisture from the monsoon, unfortunately, the benefits from this may not last all that long. Could you get into more detail about that and maybe how long we can feel those good news impacts from the monsoon for?
Yeah, so I would say think of the air and the surface of the ground and then deeper into the ground as how much memory there is. And air has a very short memory. And so we can obviously see that right after a thunderstorm, it can get really hot and dry out again. And then the surface of the ground, it can hold that moisture just a little bit longer, but the memory is still pretty short. And as you go deeper into the soils, the memory is a little bit longer. And so they might hold on to that moisture a little bit longer. But as we move into the fall and we're experiencing these very abnormally warm conditions like we're experiencing this week, and then you don't add moisture with that, it's easy for that memory in the surface to really drop off and dry out. And once you start drying out that surface, you're going to dry out that vegetation that doesn't go very deep into the soil. So these like grasses and open prairie lands are going to be the ones that dry out the quickest. And so when you have the air being hot and dry, you have the surface being hot and dry, you're starting to stress that vegetation. You're going to be at risk for worsening drought conditions again because of those dry soils. And then you're going to be at risk for wildfires again. And so I've heard from fire experts before that it may only take about 10 days of dry weather in a row to really prime those grasses and the ingredients needed for a wildfire to start and spread. And so that is something that I think would be a big concern as we go into the fall, that we've kind of said goodbye to the monsoon season. We should be transferring or transitioning to those cooler fall temperatures and starting to think about winter precipitation. And if that winter precipitation doesn't start quickly and we're not transitioning to those cooler temperatures, then both of those things are really going to put us at higher risk for drought and wildfire as we go into the fall.
I really like that memory analogy. That's an excellent way to put it. With that said, unfortunately, the outlook for the fall doesn't appear to be all that great. The Climate Prediction Center's 3-month outlook for September, October, and November pits Colorado kind of firmly in the both warmer and drier than average categories. If that takes place, which there's a lot of asterisks to that, climate going out 3 months is a very, very difficult thing for those of you out there. But
Absolutely.
um, uh, if that takes place, Becky, what sorts of impacts are we looking at? And I hate to ask this, but and bring in mind with the Marshall Fire from a year ago, but I think it's worthwhile to mention as well that would we be looking at conditions perhaps similar to what we had last December?
So the one difference I would say that we have this year compared to last year is that the Denver metro area did not have that really wet summer. And so there were that many more months that you could add to the dryness that set the stage for the Marshall Fire. And so we do have a good set of moisture that we can look at through the summer, which will hopefully mitigate that a little bit. But I would say that if it pans out that we have much warmer than average conditions throughout the fall, and if we continue to see drier than average conditions with that, we would be looking at worsening drought on the US Drought Monitor in those areas. And we would be looking at needing to continue to water your yards and plants and vegetation to keep it from drying out before it kind of goes into dormancy for the winter. We would be looking at another tough start to planting of winter wheat for the agriculture that we have throughout our state. And finally, that wildfire component we now know, particularly from these last couple of years, that we have the risk of large and or devastating wildfires that can occur in the fall and into the winter months. And so particularly if we see those hot and dry temperatures and we know that that vegetation is drying out, that is a concern that we all need to be aware of and need to be planning for and start to look for those areas around where you live that you think could be a concerning situation. Who manages those open spaces or those large grasslands? If they're growing out of control, you know, getting those maintained may be some helpful mitigation measure that can happen so that we can reduce the risk of something like that happening. But those definitely are concerns as we go into the fall with the outlook as it's shown.
Well, I guess my final main question for you, Becky, would also be we're heading into a third straight La Nina. We're, of course, that tends to lead to drier conditions for southern Colorado, perhaps a bit more hit or miss for northern Colorado. How much does that play into this forecast and outlook?
I think it is playing a good amount into this outlook, particularly on the precipitation side. On the temperature side, the Climate Prediction Center has been pretty consistent from basically late spring all through summer that our region was going to experience warmer than average temperatures. And we have, and it continues to show that high confidence. And so that might not be just the La Nina, but the agreement of the climate models coming together and saying we're still seeing that high confidence for warmer than average temperatures. And I think the slight leaning towards drier than average, there's always going to be less confidence with the precipitation outlook, especially on a seasonal time scale. But I think the leaning for that is also consistent with the La Nina pattern. It is consistent with what we've experienced for the last two La Nina falls, and so I think it's a pretty safe assumption to say we're going to lean towards that drier than average outlook for the fall. But that being said, I would not be surprised at all if the Colorado weather throws us for a loop and proves us wrong, and then we say, "Oh, I have no idea what happens during La Nina fall because it could be crazy wet." So we'll keep our fingers crossed that the Climate Prediction Center is wrong on that one.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're all hoping for that. And again, there are past instances. This past summer, I think it was supposed to be quite dry. January through March is supposed to be quite dry, and we had a pretty snowy stretch there as well. So there
Yeah,
are, for those of you watching, this is not baked in stone. To your point there, Becky, that
yeah.
again, there are certainly reasons for optimism as well. And we did have, again, a good summer, which is certainly some good news. But Dr. Becky Bollinger, thanks so much for your time here on 9 News Plus today.
Thank you for having me.